The invitation arrives sealed in midnight blue wax, stamped with the Silver Ridge Wolf insignia, a crescent moon piercing through storm clouds. Aurora Rory Thompson stares at it for 3 full breaths before her hands begin to shake, not from fear, but from the memory of what those symbols once meant to her. You are cordially invited to witness the sacred mating bond between Alpha Liam Chen and Luna Select Ruby Davis. Your presence would honor this union. But it's the handwritten line at the bottom, written in the same slanted script that once signed love notes, that makes her blood run cold. I expect you there, Rory. Don't disappoint me. Lee. 4 years. 4 years since he stood before the entire pack and called her too ordinary, too weak for an alpha. 4 years since he replaced her with Ruby Davis before the bond ink on their intended ceremony invitations had even dried. 4 years since she fled Silver Ridge with nothing but the clothes on her back and the taste of humiliation burning in her throat. And now he wants her to watch him crown the woman who helped destroy her. He wants to break you again, whispers the part of her that still remembers the laughter, the pitying stares, the way the pack turned their backs as she walked away. He wants them all to see you crawl. Rory should burn this invitation. Should let the flames consume every cursive letter, every cruel expectation. She should forget Liam Chen ever existed. Instead, she finds herself standing at the entrance of the Silver Ridge Grand Hall 3 weeks later, her pulse hammering against her ribs like a war drum. The ballroom is exactly as she remembers, impossibly grand and suffocating in its beauty. Vaulted ceilings disappear into shadows, crystal chandeliers dripping light like frozen tears across polished marble floors. Gold silk drapes the walls, and hundreds of wolves from every major pack in the territories have gathered, their formal attire gleaming, their eyes sharp with gossip and judgment. And there, at the center of the altar beneath an arch of white roses and silver branches, stands Liam. He's still beautiful in that dangerous, untouchable way, all clean lines and controlled power. His black ceremonial suit fits him like armor, and his dark eyes sweep across the crowd with the confidence of someone who has never doubted his place in the world. Beside him, Ruby Davis glows in ivory silk and diamonds, her hand resting possessively on his arm. She is everything the pack wanted, elegant, connected, flawless. Everything Rory was told she could never be. She actually came. The whisper cuts through the air like a blade. I can't believe it. After everything he did to her? I heard she's been living in exile. No pack would take her after the rejection. Pathetic. Rory keeps her chin lifted even as each word lands like a stone against her chest. She dressed carefully for this, a simple midnight blue dress that schemes her frame without trying too hard, her auburn hair swept back in a way that feels both elegant and invisible. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would give them more ammunition. But Liam has already seen her. His lips curve into a smile that holds no warmth, only victory. He descends from the altar, and the crowd parts before him instinctively, their eyes flicking between him and Rory with hungry anticipation. Rory. His voice is smooth, familiar, laced with false surprise. I wasn't sure you'd have the courage to show your face here. You invited me, she replies, her voice steadier than her hands. I assumed you wanted witnesses. I wanted you to witness. He leans in, close enough that she can smell the cedarwood cologne he always wore, close enough that his words feel like a brand. I wanted you to see what a real Luna looks like standing beside a real alpha. So you'd finally understand why I could never choose. The doors at the far end of the hall slam open. The chandeliers tremble. The crowd goes silent. And Rory's heart stops. 3 years ago, this hall had swallowed her whole. The memory flickered like a knife flash behind her eyes, and then Aurora Thompson dragged herself back to the present, to the bite of winter air and the roar of engines as sleek black cars lined the drive to Silver Ridge Pack House. She was not that girl anymore. The valet opened her door with a bow that wasn't for her, not yet. It was for the man still seated inside, the one whose aura pressed against the edges of her wolf like a storm waiting to be unleashed. Last chance to walk away, Lucas had told her earlier, voice low and steady. You owe them nothing. Rory had looked him in the eye and heard her own answer in the quiet. I'm not here for them, she'd said. I'm here for the girl who left. Now she stepped out alone. Cold bit through the thin slit of her gown, but the rest of her was warm, wrapped in the weight of black fabric and golden embroidery that traced patterns along her torso like runes. The dress hugged her curves, the deep V neckline a silent, deliberate defiance of every time she'd been called plain, forgettable, not Luna material. Silver Ridge Pack House rose above her, all floodlit stone and glass and banners. The crescent moon crest gleamed from every flag. Once, the sight had filled her with a mix of pride and belonging. Now it felt like walking into the mouth of something that had already tried to devour her once. She inhaled, slow and careful. Lucas had taught her that, root your senses before you step into enemy territory. Feel the earth. Remember you're not small. She could feel him, a steady presence at the back of her mind, held only by distance and the frayed end of patience. He would arrive later, by design. Let them see you first, he'd said. Let them underestimate you one last time. Rory climbed the steps. The guards at the great doors stiffened when they saw her. One of them flushed, the other swallowed hard. They remembered. Good. Let them. Guest of Alpha Air Liam Chen, she said, holding out the midnight blue invitation with the silver crest. Her voice didn't shake. That felt like victory. The guard took it with far more respect than Lee had ever given her. Welcome back to Silver Ridge, Miss Thompson. The doors yawned open, spilling light and sound over her. The grand ballroom was a glittering wound. Gold chandeliers dripped from the high ceilings, crystals catching the light in fractured rainbows. The air was thick with perfume, laughter, and the hum of hundreds of wolves packed into one place, their magic pressing against her skin. Every head didn't turn at once, gossip always started in pockets, but the ripple was immediate. Is that? No way. She wouldn't dare. Rory Thompson? I thought she ran with rogues. The whispers grew teeth as she walked farther in. She came back for him. Desperate. Maybe she thinks he'll change his mind. Rory kept her head high, forcing her legs to move at an unhurried pace even as adrenaline tried to rush her steps. Every instinct screamed to shrink herself, to find a dark corner and blend into the wallpaper like she'd been trained to do since childhood. She did the opposite. She moved down the center of the hall, straight toward the raised platform where the mating altar stood bathed in white light. Where he stood, Liam Chen was impossible to miss. Even among other alphas and heirs, he drew the eye, a dark, sharp blade in a room of ornamental steel. Black ceremonial jacket fitted flawlessly over broad shoulders, silver cufflinks winking when he shifted. His hair, once always messy from sneaking out with her to race along the ridge, was now slicked back in a style that screamed money and control. His hand rested on the waist of the woman by his side. Ruby Davis glowed. Her gown was a pure, relentless white that clung to her like poured silk, high at the neck with a glittering collar of crystals that dipped to reveal a perfectly judged hint of cleavage. Her golden hair cascaded in polished waves over one shoulder, every strand obedient. Even from across the hall, Rory could see the satisfaction in Ruby's smile, the way she tipped her chin as if the room existed to adore her. When Ruby's gaze finally landed on Rory, that smile sharpened. There she is, that look said. The ghost. And she actually came, someone breathed near Rory's shoulder, not bothering to lower their voice. After he dumped her in front of everyone. Did you hear she ended up working in a human bar? Another wolf added, amused. Can you imagine? Alpha's cast off taking drink orders. She always was forgettable, a third voice chimed in. I almost didn't recognize her. The dress is trying too hard. The comments hit like thrown pebbles, each one small but relentless. Her throat tightened, vision blurring for a second under the weight of old humiliation. Her wolf flinched, wanting to curl in on itself. Lucas's voice, remembered, cut through the noise. They only know the version of you they built. You've outgrown her, little wolf. Let them choke on the difference. Rory's fingers found the gold-embroidered seams at her waist and pinched, grounding herself. She unclenched her jaw. By the time she lifted her gaze again, the tears stinging her eyes had dried into something harder. Halfway across the hall, Liam finally noticed her. Shock snapped across his face like a crack in glass. His fingers tightened on Ruby's waist. Brows arched, lips parted. For a heartbeat, the mask dropped and she saw the boy she'd once loved, a flash of uncertainty, something like guilt or hunger, before it vanished. The arrogant smirk slid into place as if it had always been waiting. Ruby leaned in, whispering something into his ear. His smirk widened. Rory stopped at the foot of the steps leading to the altar. She didn't bow. She didn't look away. He made her wait. Spoke to a visiting alpha, laughed at some meaningless joke, let a few more minutes of her life tick by like she was a servant holding a tray. The pack watched it all, hunger for drama crackling in the air. Then he decided he'd made his point. Liam descended, the crowd parting around him, wolves shifting just enough to give him a clear path without turning their backs. It was muscle memory for them, heir to their pack, to their future. Once, Rory's heart had swelled with pride watching him move through a room like this. Now all she saw was how small his power felt compared to the presence humming at the edge of the territory, still approaching. Aurora. His voice was smooth, but she could hear the strain. You look different. People change, she said. His gaze flicked down, taking in the dress, the way it framed her body, the subtle strength in her stance. A muscle jumped in his jaw. So you got yourself a tailor, he said. Doesn't change what you are. What am I, Lee? She tilted her head, forcing him to say it out loud in front of his audience. He glanced around, eyes gleaming with that familiar cruelty. The pack leaned in. You're the girl who didn't know when to stay in her place, he said. I invited you because I thought you might finally have learned how to be humble. Maybe even apologize. Apologize. For being humiliated. For being discarded. A laugh bubbled in her throat, dangerously close to spilling. She bit it back. Gasps whispered through the crowd, more at his audacity than at anything she'd done. To them, this was entertainment. A pre-show before the real ceremony. Is that why Ruby's wearing white? Rory asked quietly. To make it easier for you to pretend you were never promised anyone else? Rage flashed across his features before he smoothed it away. He stepped closer, lowering his voice though he knew others would strain to hear. I'm giving you a chance, he muttered. Smile, offer your congratulations, maybe someone will take pity on you. But if you make a scene, Rory, if you try to pull my pack's attention. Your pack, she repeated softly. Are you sure? Something in her tone made him falter. His brows drew together. Before he could respond, a hush rippled through the hall, different from gossip, deeper. Instinctive. Rory felt it first as pressure behind her ribs, a shift in the air like the space between lightning and thunder. Her wolf lifted its head, ears pricked, tail high. The chandeliers rattled. The massive double doors at the far end of the hall slammed open so hard the sound cracked like a whip. Wind howled through the entryway, snuffing out a line of candles and sending silk banners snapping against the stone. Every wolf in the room stiffened. Framed in the doorway under the cold glow of the full moon stood a tall figure clad in black. Silver hair spilled over his shoulders, catching the light in molten strands. His eyes, even at that distance, were shards of winter sky, piercing, unblinking, fixed on one person only. Aurora Thompson. A murmur swept the hall, fear and awe twisting together. Alpha King. Lucas Gray. Liam's hand dropped from her arm. Rory's heart, which had been beating like a trapped bird since she stepped into the hall, went suddenly quiet, as if the organ itself bowed. Lucas Gray stepped forward, each stride measured, deliberate, the weight of his authority bending the air around him. No one laughed now. For a heartbeat, no one in the ballroom remembered how to breathe. Lucas Gray did not stride so much as cut through the crowd, the air warping around him with every step, wolves instinctively shifting aside without being told, heads bowing, shoulders hunching, as though some ancient bone-deep instinct ordered them to lower themselves or be crushed. The chandeliers above swayed, crystals chiming like nervous teeth, and the full moon framed him in the archway behind, turning his silver hair into a living halo of ice and steel. Rory couldn't move. Her pulse had been a frantic drum moments ago, but now it was a dull, heavy thud she felt everywhere at once, behind her eyes, in her fingertips, in the soles of her feet rooted to the polished marble floor. Lucas's gaze never left her. Not once. Not when high-ranking alphas dipped their heads in greeting. Not when elders reached for the faintest scrap of his attention. They were ghosts to him. Background noise. He was a storm with a single point of focus, and that focus was the woman standing at the base of the altar in a black and gold gown, wearing someone else's shame like a borrowed coat she was finally ready to shrug off. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the temperature shift, close enough to catch the wild scent of alpine wind, pine, and the metallic tang of restrained power. Those winter blue eyes softened by a fraction, almost imperceptibly, but she felt it like the first warm breath after drowning. "You kept me waiting, little wolf," he said, voice low, carrying anyway, slipping through the silence like smoke. The nickname, normally a private thing murmured against her hair or broken into a half-laugh when she challenged him, sounded utterly different here, possessive, intimate, a claim wrapped in amusement. Someone near the front choked. Ruby Davis went as still as glass. The Alpha's chosen Luna stood at the top of the steps in her immaculate white silk, every hair in place, every line of her body sculpted for perfection, and in an instant, perfection looked fragile. Her painted mouth parted in a silent O, eyes darting between Rory and Lucas like her mind refused to accept that the universe had shifted without asking her permission. Lee, beside her, lost his color in real time. The arrogant smirk he'd been wearing like armor a heartbeat ago slid right off his face, leaving something raw and ugly the pack had never been allowed to see: fear. My king," he managed, the title half-strangled. No one looked at him. Lucas lifted Rory's hand with a slow, deliberate care that made her fingers tremble despite her best effort to hold steady. His touch was warm, sure, grounding. He didn't snatch or yank or haul her like a prize, he simply took what was his as if the act itself rewrote the hall's history. For a breath, he just held her there, their joined hands hanging in the charged air between them, his thumb brushing once over the pulse at her wrist as if checking that she was really here, really alive. Then he bent his head. The Alpha King of the territories, the wolf most of this room had only ever seen from a distance or heard whispered about in stories meant to frighten arrogant heirs into caution, brought Rory's knuckles to his lips and pressed a kiss to them. It wasn't chaste. It wasn't obscene. It was reverent, a vow given shape. The reaction was immediate and violent. Gasps ripped through the crowd like a sudden gust, overlapping with low growls that rumbled from deep chests as jealous wolves bristled, confused wolves panicked, and ambitious wolves watched their carefully stacked plans crumble. The sound of magic thrummed under it all, the collective pack aura reacting to a power far older and harsher than their own. Someone snarled, quickly hushed. A younger wolf's claws slid out with a screech against marble before an elder cuffed him silent. Even the orchestra, tucked into a corner, stumbled to a halt mid-note, the last violin string whining into quiet. "What are you doing?" Lee demanded, voice cracking a little too high. He tried to disguise it as righteous outrage, stepping forward like he still thought he owned the center of this room. "With respect, my king, she's a former pack member, nothing more. She has no status here." Lucas didn't release Rory's hand. If anything, his grip tightened. When he finally looked at Lee, warmth drained from his eyes, leaving nothing but that glacial weight Rory had seen only once, on the night he'd torn apart a rogue alpha circle for hunting omegas for sport. "You presume to tell me who has status," Lucas said softly. The quiet of his tone was far more terrifying than a shout. "In my presence." Lee swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing hard. "I only meant that she has a history. With us. With me. She might have misled you." Ruby found her voice, desperation sharpening its edges. "She was never meant for more than this pack," she said, the words rushing out. "We tried to help her, but she's weak, my king. Too soft. Too ordinary. You deserve, careful, Lucas cut in, not even glancing her way. His focus remained locked on Lee, as if Ruby were a buzzing insect hovering near the conversation. The next word you choose will decide whether this remains a social event or becomes instructional. The threat hung there, gentle as snowfall, absolute as death. You could have heard a pin drop. Rory's heartbeat thundered in her ears, but beneath the fear, something else coiled, heat, fierce and unseen. Not just for herself, but for every version of her these people had tried to erase. You're making some kind of statement, right? Lee pushed, tone turning brittle. Teaching humility, I get it. But don't forget whose ceremony this is. You can't just walk in and, Aurora Thompson, Lucas said, voice rising over Lee's without effort, pitched for the room, for the walls, for the moon. It rolled through the hall with the weight of a decree. Every head turned fully to Rory now, as if a command had shifted beneath the words. Her name had never sounded like that before, whole, important, like each syllable was a tile in a mosaic that had finally been turned face up. Lucas continued, my Luna. The words detonated. Shock slammed through the ballroom in a nearly physical wave, wolves staggering back a step, others clutching their chests as their beasts reacted to the hierarchy shift. Power rippled out from Lucas in concentric circles, an invisible pressure that shoved against bone and will alike. Rory felt it less like force and more like heat blooming outward from where his hand wrapped around hers, spreading through her veins until her skin buzzed. She expected to flinch. To shy away. Instead, she straightened. Something inside her synced to that declaration with frightening ease, as if the universe sighed, finally. By blood, by bond, by right of the moon, Lucas went on, eyes sweeping the gathered wolves with cold authority, you will recognize her. An elder at the far edge of the hall tried to resist. Rory saw it in the tight line of her mouth, the flare of her nostrils, the way her spine locked, but even she buckled after a moment, knees bending under the sheer gravity of the Alpha King's command. One by one, bodies yielded. Heads lowered. Backs bent. The sound of dozens, then hundreds, of knees hitting marble echoed like distant thunder. Some bowed gracefully. Others fought it, snarling, teeth bared as their wolves clawed for control. But the result was the same. The entire Silver Ridge ballroom knelt. Liam Chen, heir of Silver Ridge, dropped to one knee. Rage twisted his features, humiliation burning dark in his eyes, but he bowed. The pack laws in his bones wouldn't let him do anything else. Ruby Davis, future Luna no more, wavered at the top of the steps, clutching at her chest as if she could physically hold on to the status slipping through her fingers. Her wolf howled soundlessly behind her eyes, refusing, and then, with a shudder, Ruby folded. White silk pulled around her as she sank into a kneel, head bowed, hands trembling against the floor. The sight hit Rory harder than she expected. This was the girl who had smiled while helping push her off the edge. The girl who had whispered poison into Lee's ear, who had watched Rory fall apart with something like satisfaction. And now she knelt to the person she'd tried to erase. Not because Rory had demanded it. Because the world itself was rearranging its lines around a truth Ruby couldn't undo. Look, Lucas murmured, so only Rory could hear. This is the weight of what you are. Not because of me. Because of you. Her throat tightened. They're bowing to you, she whispered back, feeling suddenly dizzy. They're bowing to us, he corrected. His thumb brushed her knuckles again, that small, grounding motion at odds with the chaos around them. Get used to it, little wolf. The orchestra hadn't dared resume. No one moved except to hold their bow a fraction deeper, to avert their gaze, to ensure no hint of disrespect could be misread as challenge. Rory stood in the eye of a storm she had never meant to summon, wearing a dress she'd once thought was too much for her, holding the hand of the most powerful wolf in existence. 3 years ago, these walls had watched her shatter. Today, they watched her remade. Somewhere in the crowd, someone started to whisper her new title, uncertain at first, then stronger. Luna. Another voice echoed it. Then another. Soon the word threaded through the hall like a new song. Not everyone said it. Not everyone meant it. But it was there. Real. Spoken. Claiming space. Rory inhaled, the air tasting different now, charged and sharp and terrifyingly alive. She could feel the point where there was no going back, a line drawn behind her, thin as a hair and bright as a blade. On one side was the girl who had been laughed out of this pack, who'd run into the dark with broken pride and shaking hands. On the other side stood the woman the moon itself seemed to be watching. Her fingers tightened around Lucas's. He answered with a squeeze that felt like an anchor thrown into stormy seas. Her heart gave one hard, steady beat. Then another. Aurora Thompson understood, with a clarity that burned straight through the last of her illusions, that her life was never going to fit inside the small, shrinking shape this pack had carved for her. Whatever came next, love, war, prophecy, power, it would not be quiet, it would not be safe, and it would never again belong to the girl who had once begged to be chosen. That version of her had died on this floor 3 years ago. The Luna standing here now was not going back into the grave. Later, when the ceremony's chaos had settled into a tense, humming quiet, Rory found herself alone on a balcony that overlooked the Silver Ridge grounds, the night air cold enough to sting her lungs, the moon hanging heavy and bright like a watching eye. The ballroom's music had started again behind her, a brittle, forced celebration over a shattered script, but out here the only sound was the wind combing through the trees and the distant murmur of wolves trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. She braced her hands on the stone railing, the gold embroidery at her wrists glowing faintly under the moonlight, and tried to breathe past the knot in her throat. They were calling her Luna now. Not all of them, not sincerely, but the word had been spoken, and it clung to her skin like starlight she wasn't sure she had earned. She closed her eyes, and Silver Ridge, 3 years ago, rose up around her as if the past had only been waiting for the right crack in her armor to slip through. In memory, she was smaller. Shoulders hunched. Clothes plain. That girl had walked these same halls carrying trays instead of wearing gowns, fetching drinks instead of being handed them, listening to the same wolves who mocked her now complain about omegas who didn't know their place. She remembered Ruby's laughter at 18, smooth and sweet as honey over poison. "Oh, Rory, you don't really think they'll make you Luna, do you?" Ruby had said once, arm linked with Rory's as if they were friends. "You're nice. The pack needs someone more impressive." At the time, Rory had laughed it off, pretending the words didn't sting. But she'd gone back to her little attic room and stared at herself in the cracked mirror, suddenly aware of every ordinary inch, her too soft curves, her quiet eyes, her hair that never seemed to sit the way glamorous girls did. The next day, Ruby had accidentally spilled crimson wine all over Rory's only decent dress right before a pack gathering, clucking her tongue with faux sympathy as Rory scrambled to clean the stain. "You can still come," Ruby had said, already shimmering in silver silk. "Just, maybe stay toward the back. Alphas notice when you try too hard." Lee had laughed when he saw her in dull, hastily borrowed clothes, not unkindly, but not kindly either. "You didn't have to come if you weren't ready, Rory," he'd said, without offering his jacket, without calling out Ruby's lie. "I don't want people to get the wrong idea about us." That had been the beginning, she realized now, the first small fracture in a bond she'd believed was unbreakable. The night he called her nothing came later, in front of everyone. She could still feel the exact texture of it, like glass ground into her chest. They'd been in the training ring, pack members gathered to watch the pre-ceremony spar, a tradition meant to show how united an alpha and his future mate were, how their wolves moved in sync. Rory had been nervous but excited, ready to show she was learning, that she could be what the pack needed. Ruby had stood at the edge, eyes glittering, whispering to anyone who'd listen. Lee had stepped into the ring with the easy swagger he'd never earned. He'd thrown practice jabs, playful at first, until she'd stumbled. A snicker from the crowd, a comment about omega reflexes. Something hot and humiliating had rushed up her neck, making her slow, making her clumsy. And then Lee had looked at her, really looked at her, and instead of the boy who used to sneak her extra desserts and bandage her scrapes, she'd seen a calculating stranger. "Stop," he'd said loudly, so everyone could hear. This is pointless. She's not Luna material. She's nothing special. The words had landed like a public sentencing. Laughter, poorly hidden. Ruby's eyebrows arched in faux pity. Her wolf had flinched so hard inside her that she'd nearly fallen to her knees. Now, on the balcony, her fingers dug into stone as if she could steady both past and present at once. It would have been easy to drown in those memories, to let them rewrite who she was even now, in a gown that caught the moonlight and with a king whose scent still clung to her skin. But another set of memories rose up to meet them, stubborn as dawn. A snowy mountain pass, wind slicing at her cheeks, breath burning in her chest as she struggled to keep up with the massive silver wolf ahead of her. She had been half frozen, half starved, hunted by rogues and numb from heartbreak, when he'd found her curled behind a fallen log, teeth chattering too hard to speak. Lucas had shifted slowly then, giving her time to look away if she wanted, not looming or baring teeth, just kneeling in the snow with his hands open and empty. "You're trespassing in my territory," he'd said, voice rough with cold and something like surprise. "And you're half dead." When she'd whispered that she could keep going, that she didn't need help, that she was used to being unwanted, something had flickered in his eyes, anger, but not at her. "Who taught you that?" he'd asked quietly. "Who convinced you that surviving alone is the same as being unworthy?" In the weeks that followed, he'd never once called her weak. He'd watched her try to shift and fail, watched her breath hitch with old fear whenever someone raised their voice, and instead of mocking, he'd adjusted. Again, he'd say in the training court, calm as the steady thud of his footsteps circling her. "Your wolf isn't fragile, Rory. She's cautious. There's a difference." When she'd snapped that he didn't understand, that she turned slow and hesitant and that Lee had been right to be embarrassed, Lucas had stepped into her space, towering, but his touch had been feather-light as he rested 2 fingers against the side of her neck. "Your wolf slept because someone taught her the world wasn't safe," he'd murmured. "Not because she's weak. Power that survives like that? That's the kind that doesn't burn out." He'd seen her lose control once, months later, when old nightmares had clawed their way back and she'd woken with her hands glowing faintly under the covers, the room buzzing with raw energy. Instead of flinching, he'd sat on the edge of her bed and closed his hand over hers, guiding her fingers into his own slow breathing rhythm until the light dimmed. "Power isn't about volume," he'd told her. "It's not about screaming the loudest or throwing the hardest punch. It's about choosing when not to." Under his patience, training had become less punishment and more conversation with a part of herself she'd been terrified to meet. She learned how to shift without panic, how to move with purpose instead of flinching at every shadow. When her wolf finally emerged fully, sleek and silver-marked under the moon, Lucas hadn't cheered or bragged. He'd simply bowed his head to her wolves in acknowledgement, as if she was an equal, not a project. And yet, standing here now, with an entire pack still buzzing from the fact that their once rejected nobody had been claimed by a king, Rory's chest felt too tight with a different kind of fear. "You're quiet," Lucas's voice came from behind her, his presence as unmistakable as a shift in gravity. She didn't turn, she didn't need to. She knew exactly how he'd be standing, arms loose at his sides, posture relaxed but ready, like the world could break and he'd still be prepared to catch whatever mattered. "I was loud enough tonight," she said softly, eyes on the distant tree line. "Whether I meant to be or not." He stepped to her side, leaning his elbows on the railing so their shoulders nearly brushed. "That wasn't loud," he replied. "That was truth rearranging the room." She let out a brittle laugh. "They were on their knees because you told them to be, Lucas. Not because of me." "You really believe that?" he asked, not offended, more curious than anything. She hesitated. "I believe," her voice thinned. "I believe I walked into that hall as the girl they used to trip in the corridors just to laugh when I fell. And I walked out with wolves choking on the word Luna. I don't know how to bridge those 2 versions of me. I don't know which one is real." He studied her for a long moment, the moonlight catching in his eyes, making them pale and sharp. "They're both real," he said finally. "The girl they broke. And the Luna you are. One doesn't erase the other." She's the reason you understand what power feels like from the bottom as well as the top. She swallowed hard. What if they're right, though? Lee, Ruby, all of them. What if I'm just ordinary dressed up in something extraordinary that doesn't really belong to me? What if I make a mistake and the whole world sees that the king chose wrong? The question had lived under her tongue since the first time he'd called her mine. Tonight had just ripped the thin cloth off it. Lucas turned fully then, one hand coming up, not to grip, not to force her chin up, but to hover just beneath it, a touch waiting for permission. When she didn't pull away, he let his fingers rest there, gentle and steady, tilting her face toward his. Listen to me, he said, every word deliberate. I did not drag you out of some pity story because I needed a pretty Luna on my arm. I chose you because when I found you half broken and still moving forward, I saw more strength in you than in 100 alphas who've never had to bleed for what they are. His thumb traced a brief, soothing arc along her jaw. You think power is these chandeliers and titles and people flinching when I raise my voice. That's theater. Real power is what it took for you to walk back into the room that tried to kill you and not bow your head. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. What if I fail you, she whispered. What if I fail them? Then we deal with it, he said simply. Together. You're allowed to be scared, Rory. You're allowed to doubt. That doesn't make you unworthy, it makes you dangerous in the right way, because you'll never forget what it feels like to be standing where they are. He nodded toward the glowing windows of the ballroom, where silhouettes still shifted uneasily. I don't need a Luna who thinks she's flawless. I need one who remembers what it is to be overlooked. She looked back out at the tree line, the wind ruffling her hair, the weight of his words settling heavy and strange in her chest, like armor still too big, but hers. Somewhere inside, her wolf stirred, pressing gently against the edges of her thoughts, not with the frantic panic of before, but with a quiet, steady presence. We're still us, the feeling seemed to say. We're just more. And still, the fear lingered. The question she couldn't shake, whether a girl who'd been told her whole life she was nothing could truly stand beside a king and not eventually crumble under the expectations that came with the crown. As the moon climbed higher and the night deepened around them, Aurora Thompson, broken girl, almost Luna, rogue, survivor, stood next to the Alpha King and wondered if she would ever fully believe she belonged there, or if a part of her would always be waiting to wake up back in that attic room, alone, hearing Lee's voice in the hallway, laughing about how ordinary she was. Rory didn't even hear the music stop. One moment she was standing near the balcony doors trying to steady her breath after the whirlwind of the night, and the next she felt the shift in the air, cold and venomous, the kind that announces danger before a single word is spoken. She turned, and there they were, Ruby in gleaming white silk like a blade disguised as beauty, her parents flanking her like wolves pretending to be royalty, each stare filled with something too satisfied to be surprise. We were wondering how long you'd hide behind him, Ruby purred, stepping forward with slow, predatory grace, and the way she said him made it obvious she meant Lucas, not Lee. Rory forced her spine straight and said nothing, because silence was the only weapon she trusted herself to wield without shaking. Ruby's smile sharpened. You think tonight was fate? You think the Alpha King just found you and decided you were special? She leaned closer, breath dripping sugar and venom. No, sweetheart. Everything that happened to you, every slight, every humiliation, every rumor, we designed it. 1,000 memories detonated in Rory's mind, spilled wine, ruined dresses, whispers that spread too fast to be coincidence, Lee growing colder by the week while Ruby hovered close, and suddenly it all had a mastermind. Ruby's mother folded her arms, eyes glowing faintly. The Moonborn lineage should have ended generations ago, yet somehow it clung to you, too quiet to notice, too weak to be taken seriously. Until he found you. Ruby's father added, we had to destroy you before the Moonborn could rise again, before a prophecy could threaten everything our bloodline has built. Prophecy. Bloodline. Words that sounded too big, too ancient, too surreal, and yet something deep inside Rory flinched in recognition like a locked door rattling under a storm. Ruby sneered. Don't look so shocked. You didn't think Lee chose me over you because I was prettier, did you? He chose me because I belong to the bloodline that was meant to rule. And you, her voice dropped to a hiss, you were meant to disappear. Rory's voice came out in a whisper. All of this, was to erase me? Ruby laughed. To erase what you are. She raised her hand then, not a gesture of drama, but of precision, and the floor pulsed with a sudden magic that didn't belong to wolves or tradition, a ritual circle forming around Rory faster than she could step back, silver lines locking under her feet like chains made of light. The world tilted, her vision blurring as heat flooded her skull, and suddenly every insecurity, every wound, every memory of being unwanted detonated at once, multiplied, sharpened, weaponized against her. Ruby's voice slithered into her thoughts like a hook, dragging her toward collapse. You are nothing. You were always nothing. You only exist because someone else failed to kill your bloodline. Rory fell to her knees, the ballroom spinning into a nightmare, her heartbeat thrashing inside her skull like it was trying to escape her body. Ruby's silhouette blurred and fractured, but Rory could still see the smug triumph on her face. I'm not killing you, Ruby murmured, kneeling beside her like a friend comforting a broken thing. I'm reminding you of the truth so you can choke on it. When you shatter, the prophecy ends. The ritual circle flared brighter, but something inside Rory snapped differently than Ruby intended. It wasn't collapse. It wasn't surrender. It was the opposite, like a blade that had been rusted suddenly remembering it was steel. One tremor ran through her body, then another, then a crack of light burst from her chest so suddenly Ruby stumbled backward with a gasp. The ritual lines shattered, exploding like glass dissolving into smoke, and Rory's vision went white, not from pain but from power awakening like it had been waiting for this exact moment, silver aura roaring around her in a shockwave so violent chandeliers overhead shook and cracked. She heard someone screaming, and only after a heartbeat did she realize the voice wasn't hers, it was Ruby's. The magic Ruby had cast recoiled, crashing backward into her mind like a weapon turned toward its wielder. She clawed at her skull, collapsing, her white silk dress stained with the blood from her nose as she shrieked, "Stop her! Stop her!" Rory couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't contain the force pouring out of her, memories of power she never understood, echoes of wolves she'd never met, a lineage rising in her bones like fire remembering it was born from the moon. Through the ringing in her ears she heard a voice, not Ruby's, not Lucas's, ancient, echoing inside her mind from a distant place where fate is carved. The moonborn Luna is born only once, to dethrone the unworthy. Her body trembled violently, her aura flickering like a storm running out of fuel, and then everything went dark, not the soft darkness of sleep but the hard, sudden drop of power draining all at once. She collapsed just as warm, steady hands caught her mid-fall, the world grounding in the scent she could recognize anywhere, storm and ice and wild devotion. Lucas lifted her into his arms, muscles hard and tense as steel under her cheek, his voice a low thunder she could barely hear through the fog. "I've got you," he growled, and it wasn't reassurance, it was a vow. Chaos roared behind them, gasps, shouts, someone sobbing, elders snarling as they restrained Ruby, but Lucas didn't slow, didn't look back, carrying Rory out of the hall like the world could burn around them and he would still not loosen his hold. Her consciousness flickered, fading, but even in the blur she heard the elders, their voices not shocked but horrified, reverent, "The moonborn Luna has awakened. Then the prophecy is real. If so, the unworthy will fall." The last words Rory registered before the darkness took her were not Lucas's, nor the elders, but the eerie whisper echoing inside her mind like the moon itself had spoken it, "The moonborn Luna is born only once, to dethrone the unworthy." Rory woke to the sound of her own heartbeat, loud and unsteady, like drums echoing down a long stone corridor, and for a moment she didn't know where she was, only that the ceiling above her wasn't the glittering chandeliers of Silver Ridge but rough-hewn stone softened by flickering amber light. The air smelled of smoke and pine, not perfume, and polished marble, and the sheets beneath her fingers were warm, heavy, real. Her head pounded in a slow, dull ache, a reminder that something inside her had broken and reformed all at once. When she tried to sit up, a low voice from the shadows stopped her. "Easy, little wolf." Lucas stepped into the glow of the fireplace, silver hair loose around his shoulders, formal jacket gone, sleeves rolled up, looking less like an untouchable king and more like a man who hadn't moved from that spot since she fell. There was exhaustion in the lines of his face, but his eyes, those storm-colored eyes, were sharp and locked on her like she was the only thing in the room that mattered. "How long was I out?" she asked, her voice rough. "A few hours," he said. "Long enough for every elder in that hall to start whispering about prophecies and omens. Long enough for Ruby to be escorted out screaming. Long enough for me to realize that if you didn't open your eyes, I was going to burn Silver Ridge to the ground." The last part was said lightly, but there was a truth under it that made her chest tighten. "You carried me out," she murmured, remembering flashes, his arms, his scent, the world tilting. "There was no one else I would have trusted to touch you," he replied simply. Silence settled between them, a steady, humming thing that wasn't awkward so much as loaded, filled with all the questions she had been running from since the moment he walked into the ceremony and called her his Luna. "Lucas," she said finally, fingers curling in the blanket, "who am I?" His gaze softened. "You're Aurora Thompson," he said. "The girl who used to hide her laugh because someone told her it was too loud. The wolf who survived being abandoned by the pack that should have protected her. The Luna whose power shook an entire territory awake tonight." He stepped closer, each movement unhurried, like approaching a frightened animal he refused to startle. "And you are Moonborn, Rory. Your bloodline carries the echo of the first wolves who walked under the full moon and didn't bow." The word settled over her like a cloak, too heavy and too right all at once. "How long have you known?" she whispered. "Since the night I found you." He sat on the edge of the bed, keeping a careful distance, his hands loose on his knees. "You were half frozen in that ravine, your wolf barely clinging to consciousness. But your aura, the way the moonlight bent around you, the way your presence felt like quiet gravity, I knew. I knew exactly who you were." She stared at him, hurt flashing through her. "And you didn't tell me?" "If I had," he said gently, "would you have believed me? Or would you have thought it was another game, another way for someone stronger to pull your strings?" The worst part was that she knew the answer. "So you lied by omission." "I waited," he corrected softly. "I waited for you to see yourself as more than what they told you you were. I waited for you to choose me without my title, without the prophecy, without the weight of destiny hanging over our heads. I wanted you to choose as Rory, not as Moonborn Luna." Her throat tightened. No one had ever waited on her terms before. No one had ever given her space to become anything more than what they needed. "I spent years thinking I lost the love of my life," she said quietly, more to the fire than to him. "When Lee left me standing there, when he called me weak and ordinary, I thought my world was ending. I thought I had lost everything." Her hand trembled as she lifted it, staring at the faint shimmer in her skin where the golden light had burst from her earlier. "But standing in that hall tonight, with you calling me Luna and Ruby Spiral because she couldn't break me the way they planned, I realized something. I didn't lose love back then. I lost an illusion. I lost a boy who loved the idea of power more than he ever loved me." The admission hurt and healed all at once, like stitching over an old wound that had never been properly closed. Lucas's expression was unreadable for a moment, then something fierce and proud broke through. "Exactly," he said. "You didn't lose anything of value, Rory. The ones who broke their promise lost you." She let out a shaky breath. "And now everyone wants something from me again. Ruby wants revenge. The elders want reassurance. The territories want a symbol. I can feel it, Lucas. This thing inside me." Her fingers pressed against her chest. "It's loud now. It's hungry. It feels like I'm holding a weapon, and I don't know if I should be allowed to." His gaze locked on hers with that steady, grounding intensity. "Listen to me," he said, each word deliberate. "You are not a weapon." "You saw what I did in that hall," she whispered. "The light, the power, Ruby's magic breaking apart. I could have killed her if I hadn't passed out. I don't even know how I did it." "What you did," he replied, "was defend your mind from someone trying to shatter it. The power responded to a threat. You didn't reach for it to hurt, you reached for it to survive." Her eyes burned. What if that changes? What if I change? What if one day I get angry, or scared, or hurt, and this power doesn't care who it hits? Lucas leaned closer, slow enough that she could have stopped him with a glance if she wanted to. You're afraid you'll become exactly what they're afraid of, he murmured. And exactly what Ruby prayed you'd become, so she could point and say, see? She's a monster. Rory swallowed hard. Yes. His voice dropped, low and iron-bound. There is something you need to understand, Aurora Thompson. You were never meant to be used. He lifted his hand then, hesitant, and when she didn't pull away, he brushed his knuckles against her cheek, the touch so gentle it made her eyes sting. You were meant to be obeyed. The words sank into her like a truth she had been waiting her whole life to hear but never thought she deserved. Obeyed. Not worshipped. Not exploited. Not pushed onto a pedestal or nailed to a cross. Obeyed, respected, listened to, followed. I don't know how to be that person, she confessed, voice breaking. I don't know how to be a Luna to a king. I still flinch when someone raises their voice. I still hear Lee's words when I look in the mirror. Good. The interruption startled her. She blinked. Good? Yes, he said. Because the wolves who terrify me the most are the ones who never doubt, never question, never feel guilt. Power without reflection is what creates tyrants. The fact that you're afraid of what you could do tells me you'll be careful with what you hold. His thumb caught a tear before it could fall. I'd rather have a Luna who worries she might hurt someone than one who never thinks twice. The room felt smaller suddenly, the space between them charged with something that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the way her pulse raced under his touch, the way his eyes flicked to her mouth and then back up, as if he was reining himself in out of respect. Lucas, she whispered, and there was a whole question in his name. Who am I to you? Am I destiny? Duty? Convenience? Or am I just me? His answer came in the quiet way his gaze softened. You are the thing I didn't think I would get, he said. Not in this lifetime. Not in any. I made peace a long time ago with ruling alone, with carrying this crown until it crushed me. Then I found a half-frozen wolf in a ravine who looked at me like I was just a man offering a blanket, not a king demanding loyalty. His breath brushed her lips now, that close, and her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to break free just to get closer to him. Every instinct in me wants to bind you to my side, he admitted, voice rough. To mark you, claim you, make sure no one ever looks at you the way they did tonight. But I won't do that without your full, clear choice. Not as a reaction. Not as a shield. Only when you want me as much as I want you. The honesty undid her more than any command could have. She leaned in, just a fraction, drawn by the gravity between them, feeling his hand slide to the back of her neck, fingers curling into her hair in a way that felt both protective and possessive. Their foreheads touched, breaths mingling, the rest of the world falling away until there was only the electric line between almost and too much. She started, but the word dissolved into air. She did want him, his steadiness, his brutal honesty, the way he saw both her power and her broken places and didn't flinch from either, but the night's revelation still hung around them like smoke. If she kissed him now, it would be with adrenaline still buzzing in her veins, fear still clawing at her ribs, prophecy still echoing in her ears. It would be real, but it would also be tangled in everything she wasn't ready to untangle. Lucas exhaled slowly, the sound half a groan, half a surrender. He pressed the lightest kiss imaginable to her forehead instead, lingering there for a heartbeat that felt like a promise. Then he pulled back just enough to meet her eyes again. Not tonight, he murmured. Tonight you rest. Tonight you remember that you survived them, and that your power answered to you, not to Ruby, not to prophecy, not to fear. He stood, though it clearly cost him, every line of his body taut with restraint. Sleep, little wolf. When you wake, we'll decide what to do with a world that's suddenly very afraid of you. As he moved toward the door, Rory watched him go with a strange, quiet certainty blooming in her chest. The thing they all feared wasn't her power alone. It was her, a girl they tried to break, who had finally learned she'd only ever been holding an illusion. And when the door closed softly behind Lucas Gray, she realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the dark. The dark was afraid of her. Rory stood on the balcony of the Silver Ridge pack house, the moon hanging low enough to touch, the wind cold enough to sting, yet for the first time in years she felt steady, not unshakable, not fearless, but steady, as if the ground beneath her belonged to her feet instead of waiting to collapse. Below, wolves moved like restless shadows, murmuring about council votes and shifting power. Lucas was meeting with the elders regarding the aftermath of the ceremony, and the entire hierarchy of Silver Ridge was trembling. Because of her. Because she existed, not as the girl they threw away, but as the Luna the Alpha King chose. The balcony doors creaked open, slow and hesitant, and she didn't need to turn to know who stood there. The air changed, thickened with the familiar scent she once mistook for safety. Lee. He didn't carry arrogance in his posture tonight, only desperation disguised as humility. Rory, he said, voice low, like he expected her to melt at the sound of her name on his tongue, like old reflexes might still live in her bones. She didn't look at him, not yet. Silence would be her first answer. The council, they stripped my voting seat, he continued, taking a step closer, echoing the news she already knew. When she still didn't answer, the words tumbled out faster. Rory, please, people are acting like I'm nothing now. She turned then, slow and deliberate. Now? The single word hit him harder than shouting ever could. He swallowed, eyes flickering over her, the silver gown Lucas had gifted her, the crescent moon pendant resting against her collarbone, the posture of someone who was no longer afraid to take up space. I didn't mean for it to go this way, he whispered, and there it was, the old tactic, softened guilt, practiced remorse. I shouldn't have said those things to you. I was stupid. I was young. You were cruel, she corrected, not with venom, only truth. You wanted to show the world you were powerful, so you broke the easiest target and called it leadership. He flinched, but didn't leave. I thought one day I'd make it up to you, he said, desperation growing. And when you came back, when I saw you, I realized I never stopped wanting you. Rory let the words hang between them. Once, they would have been everything, the apology she waited for, the confession she begged for in silence. Now they felt thin, insufficient, too late. She stepped closer, and he looked hopeful for a moment, pathetic in his hope, until she spoke. You didn't want me, she said softly. You wanted someone who made you look powerful. Someone who made you feel bigger. Her voice never rose. That hurt more. You didn't remember you loved me, she continued. You remembered you owned me. And when you saw someone else value me, truly value me, that's when you decided you wanted me back. His eyes widened, panic racing beneath the surface. Rory. I can do better now, I hope you do, she whispered, and the kindness in her voice shattered him more than anger ever could. But I won't be the lesson that teaches you how to love. His breath stalled, like her words had struck a place too raw to hide. You can hate me if it helps, she added gently. But I don't hate you anymore. And I think that's what truly ends this. A sound escaped him, not rage, not pleading, something worse, the sound of a man realizing the thing he thought would wait for him never would again. Go home, Lee, she said. Heal. Grow. And stop trying to reach for the person you broke. He staggered back as if physically shoved, and when his eyes met hers one last time, the arrogant smirk she feared for years was gone, replaced by the look of someone finally feeling the weight of the choices he made. And then the moment shattered. The balcony doors were flung open and Ruby burst forward like a blade of jealousy, her face twisted with venom. You think you've won? She spat, lunging as if she could tear the truth out of Rory's throat. You think being chosen makes you better than me? Her fingers sparked with dark magic, not enough to kill, but enough to scar, enough to humiliate. But before she could touch Rory, 3 elders seized her wrists mid-air, and her spell flickered and died. That's enough, Elder Castor growled. Ruby thrashed, screaming, she stole everything from me. She took my mating ceremony. The elder's answer was ice. You sabotaged her life long before tonight. You orchestrated her exile. You fed lies to the council about her wolf. The downfall you suffer now is your own doing. Gasps echoed from the doorway, wolves gathering, watching. Ruby froze, realization dawning in horror as her secrets finally turned to chains. Lee stared at her the way a drowning man stares at the wave that pulls him under, betrayal layered on betrayal. Ruby shrieked, I did it for us. For our future, you did it for power, Lee croaked, voice breaking. And you used me to get it. Ruby's scream collapsed into a sob, but Rory remained still, unmoved not because she lacked empathy, but because she finally understood something liberating. Her healing was not tied to their punishment, and their punishment was not her responsibility. The elders dragged Ruby backward, her voice dissolving into incoherent hatred, and Lee sank against the balcony rail, hollow with self-inflicted ruin. Rory watched them, expression calm not because she felt nothing, but because she finally felt enough. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need validation. She didn't need to prove that she mattered. The moment she stopped trying to win back the people who broke her was the moment she won. Below, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying whispers of a pack hierarchy collapsing, shifting, rebuilding. Behind her, the shadows deepened, and the unmistakable presence she knew now by instinct approached. Lucas never spoke, never asked, never demanded, he simply stood with her, letting her choose the next step. And for the first time in her life, Rory realized her past wasn't something she needed to defeat, it was something she had outgrown. The girl they broke was gone. The Luna she became remained. The moon climbed slow and deliberate, like it knew the world was watching. From the high cliffs of Ironcrest to the shadowed valleys of Silver Ridge, wolves lifted their heads in instinctive silence as the night thickened with power. At the heart of it all, on a stone platform carved into the mountain and ringed with ancient runes, Aurora Rory Thompson stood barefoot in a circle of silver fire. The wind teased the edges of her ceremonial gown, deep indigo that drank the starlight, threaded with faint glowing lines that shifted like constellations across her skin. The fabric moved when she moved, as if the sky itself had decided to wear her. Around the ritual clearing, the highest-ranking wolves from every territory formed a circle, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight. No one spoke. No one dared. The air was too charged, too full, every breath tasting like lightning and fate. Lucas stood opposite her, just beyond the circle of flame, his expression solemn and soft all at once, wearing the dark armor of a king and the gaze of a man who would burn kingdoms before he'd let her fall. Rory, he said quietly, and even with the distance between them, she felt it, her name spoken not like an apology or a weapon, but like a vow. Her heart beat once, heavy, then again, steady. The old voices of Silver Ridge, the laughter, the whispers, the cruel words, tried to rise, but they felt small now, like echoes from a hallway she no longer lived in. She wasn't standing here to prove them wrong. She was standing here because she was finally done proving anything at all. Elder Castor stepped forward, his voice grounding the ceremony. Under the witness of the moon, he intoned, we call forth the bond of King and Luna, soul and soul, power and purpose. Alpha King Lucas Gray. Aurora Thompson of the Moonborn line. Do you come here of your own will? Lucas's answer was immediate. I do. Rory's throat tightened, but her answer came from somewhere deeper than fear. I do. The circle of silver fire stirred, rising and falling like a living thing. The moon's glow intensified, spotlighting them both, and Rory felt her power stir in response. That quiet, steady hum she had once mistaken as weakness now climbed her spine with quiet certainty. Not to hurt the past, she reminded herself as light gathered at her fingertips. To protect the future. Elder Castor lifted a silver blade, old as any legend, its edge etched with swirling marks that pulsed faintly in rhythm with Rory's heartbeat. Tonight, he said, the Moonborn line binds to the crown. Tonight, we do not create a queen of vengeance, but a Luna of balance. Power shared. Power tempered. Power chosen. Lucas stepped into the flame without hesitation. The silver parted around his boots, curling away from his skin like it recognized him and accepted what he was doing. He stopped in front of Rory, close enough that she could see the tiny scar above his left brow, the one he'd gotten sparring with her when she refused to pull her punches. His hand lifted, fingers hovering just shy of her cheek. "Last chance to run," he murmured, eyes flickering with quiet humor and something fierce and hopeful beneath it. Her chest tightened, not with doubt, but with the overwhelming reality of it all. "If you run," she said, "I'm making you chase me for the rest of your life." His laugh was soft, almost incredulous. "Deal." Elder Castor extended the blade to Lucas first. The king accepted it reverently, then turned his focus entirely on Rory. "Aurora Thompson," he said, voice dropping low but carrying easily over the gathered wolves. "You were the girl the world called ordinary. The wolf they called weak. The mate they called unworthy. They were wrong." His gaze never left hers. "You walked through exile and didn't crumble. You were broken on purpose and still chose to heal. You found power and didn't use it to destroy, you used it to stand. I ask not as a king, but as a man, will you stand beside me as my Luna? As my equal? As the voice that can stop me when no one else can?" The tears that gathered in Rory's eyes didn't fall. They simply shimmered, reflecting the moon and the flames and the man who saw every ugly part of her story and called it sacred. "Yes," she said, voice steady. "I'll stand beside you. Not behind you. Not beneath you. Beside you, or not at all." Pride flickered in his eyes like a second kind of light. Elder Castor nodded. "Then mark her, Alpha King." Lucas pressed the blade to his own palm first, drawing a line of blood that glowed faintly silver instead of red. He let the magic in the metal accept him, then passed it to Rory. The moment she took it, the runes on the blade blazed brighter, answering the call in her blood. Moonborn. Kingbound. Future tethered. "This might sting," Lucas murmured, leaning in, brushing her hair aside to bare the place where neck met shoulder, the place reserved by ancient law and instinct alike. "I've done worse," Rory whispered back, thinking of nights alone in rogue territory, of being hunted by shame and hunger and memory. "You've survived worse," he corrected. And then his teeth sank into her skin. It wasn't just pain, though that was there, sharp and hot. It was a flood. A sudden, overwhelming rush of him, his centuries of loneliness, his grit, his burden, his unwavering, relentless choice of her. Power roared through the bond like a storm breaking over a city, wild and bright and almost too much. Her knees went weak, but his arm was already around her, holding her upright, anchoring her as something ancient clicked into place between them. The circle of wolves around them gasped as the mark shimmered, not just a bite, but a crescent sigil etched in silvery light that pulsed like a second heartbeat beneath her skin. "Your turn," Elder Castor prompted gently, and Rory realized her hand was still wrapped around the blade. She took a slow breath, moved on instinct she didn't know she had, and let her power guide her hand. "Lucas Gray," she said softly, the world narrowing until there was only him. "You found me when I had nothing left. You believed in me before I believed in myself. You never tried to fix me, only to give me space to become. I mark you not as a prize, not as property, but as my partner. My home. My impossible miracle." His throat worked and, for a heartbeat, the king looked undone. She lifted his collar, bearing the place over his heart, and pressed the flat of the blade there, letting a single drop of her blood fall onto his skin. The moment it touched him, the moon answered. It wasn't just light, it was a surge. A shockwave rippled outward, visible as a ring of silver energy that expanded from their joined forms, racing across the sky, turning the stars themselves into witnesses. Above the ritual circle, a sigil bloomed in shimmering moonlight, a crescent cradling a single, bright star. The mark of the moonborn Luna. It hung there, radiant and undeniable, and in distant forests and hidden valleys, wolves who had never heard Rory's name suddenly felt their knees buckle. Pack houses miles away shuddered as dormant magic woke like something relieved. Alphas clutched their chests, feeling the shift as if the very rules of their world had been rewritten. "The bond is sealed," Elder Castor whispered, awe cutting through his usual gruff tone. The moonborn Luna has risen. Lucas exhaled slowly, his forehead resting briefly against Rory's as the power settled between them like a living promise. For the first time since she met him, she could feel his awe without needing to guess. You, his thoughts whispered through the bond, warm and fierce and reverent. Always you. She didn't answer in words. She simply let her own feelings flow back, gratitude, fear, wonder, love, all of it, unfiltered. He smiled, a small, private thing in the middle of a very public miracle. Wolves of the territories, he said, turning with his arm still around her, his voice carrying clear and absolute across the mountain. Bow to your Luna. There was a heartbeat of hesitation, old habits, old prejudices, old arrogance, and then, one by one, they folded. Alphas. Elders. Warriors. Wolves who had once whispered that she was nothing now knelt as power pressed gently but firmly on their shoulders, not crushing, but reminding. Not revenge. Recalibration. Rory looked out over all of them, Silver Ridge included, and for a split second, the girl she used to be trembled. Then she remembered the rogue nights, the training fields with Lucas, the look in his eyes when she stood her ground instead of backing down. She straightened, shoulders relaxed but unyielding, and let the moon's light pour through her without burning herself away. I won't rule through fear, she said quietly, mostly to Lucas, but the words carried anyway. No, he agreed. You'll rule through truth. And that terrifies them far more. The sigil in the sky pulsed one last time, then gentled, settling into a quiet, steady glow woven among the stars. Rory drew in a slow breath, feeling the bond between herself and Lucas settle into something solid and enduring, like bedrock beneath restless tides. She was the same girl who had once clutched a crumpled invitation with shaking hands, and yet, she was someone entirely new. Not because of the crown. Not because of the title. But because she finally understood, power wasn't what they gave her tonight. Power was what she chose to become. Aurora Thompson, the girl they laughed at, was gone. Luna Aurora Grey, moonborn and king-bonded, stood in her place, not as a symbol of revenge, but as the first line of defense for every wolf who had ever been told they were too small to matter. Under the full moon, with the world reshaped around her, Rory wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. The mountain wind had barely settled after the claiming ritual when Rory returned to Silver Ridge, not as the broken girl who once stood at the edge of every room hoping to be unnoticed, but as the Luna who now had wolves kneeling in her presence whether they wanted to or not, and yet, when she stood before the pack the next morning, there was no rage in her voice, no demand to bow out of fear. Instead, she looked into the eyes of the same wolves who once laughed, whispered, and rolled their eyes when she walked past, and she spoke with the strength of someone who finally understood that true power wasn't loud, wasn't cruel, and wasn't desperate for validation. I didn't come back to destroy you, she said, her voice steady despite the flicker of pain that memory still carried. I came back to make sure what you did to me, and to others like me, never happens again. And the gasps and murmurs that followed weren't from fear of punishment, but from the shock of being met with grace. Instead of retribution, she told them of the wolves without wealth, without status, without famous surnames, the ones they dismissed as unworthy, the ones forced to stand at the bottom of the hierarchy because someone somewhere decided their blood mattered more than their hearts, and she demanded new laws right there in front of the entire council. Every wolf, regardless of lineage or rank, would have the right to train, to shift, to choose their mate, and to rise, not because of who their parents were but because of who they proved themselves to be. Even the elders, who once rolled their eyes at the mention of change, lowered their heads when Lucas stepped forward and placed his hand at the small of Rory's back, not claiming her, not directing her, but standing beside her, silent but protective, like stone and wildfire together, and the message was indisputable. She wasn't speaking on behalf of the crown. The crown existed to amplify her voice, not replace it. The crowd listened with a stunned stillness as she confessed that the girl she once was would have begged for their approval, but the woman she had become didn't need to be loved by the world to love it anyway. And somewhere in the sea of familiar faces she saw Lee, eyes hollow, shoulders collapsed, the weight of choices finally crushing the ego that once made him feel untouchable, and for a moment the memory of the old ache sparked. not because she wanted him again, but because she remembered what it felt like to be the version of herself who thought his attention was the definition of being enough, and now she saw him clearly, not a monster, not a villain, not even a threat, just a boy who had mistaken power for popularity and love for possession. She didn't speak to him directly, she didn't shame him publicly, she didn't expose his desperation, she simply looked at him once, steady, calm, with no leftover desire or hatred, and he broke more under that silence than he ever had under rejection because he finally understood she had moved on without needing to prove anything. Later that night, the palace corridors were quiet when Rory found herself alone for the first time since the ritual, standing before a floor-length mirror framed in obsidian and silver, and she stared, not to check whether the gown flattered her or whether the mark on her neck gleamed brightly enough, but because she needed to take a real breath and face the truth of who she had become, the girl who once apologized for taking up space, for having emotions, for wanting to be chosen, was gone, and in her place was a woman with power in her bones and tenderness in her voice, a woman who understood that leadership wasn't about attention, it was about responsibility. Lucas appeared in the reflection a moment later, not touching her, not speaking, simply waiting until she decided what she needed from him, and when she finally turned, she rested her forehead against his chest, not for support, but for connection, and he wrapped his arms around her without hesitation, murmuring, "You didn't just survive them, you outgrew them," and she whispered back, "I didn't win because I became Luna. I won because I became myself," and something softened in her that she didn't realize was still tense, something old and small finally releasing its grip on her spirit. She walked back to the mirror and didn't see royalty, didn't see scars, didn't see perfection, she saw identity, the woman she was always meant to become, and with a slow breath, a soft, quiet smile curved her lips not from pride but from peace. She didn't need applause, or apologies, or revenge, the victory was already hers. Because she rose without becoming the very cruelty that once crushed her, and as she turned away from the mirror, stepping into the throne room with Lucas beside her, hand in hand like equals, the world shifted in a way that felt both final and beginning, a new era unfolding not because she stole the crown, but because she earned its weight, and in that silent, powerful moment, one truth settled in her chest with the certainty of destiny. She was never created to be chosen, she was created to lead. Which part hit you the hardest, Rory walking back into the pack that rejected her, or the moment the Alpha King claimed her in front of them? Tell me in the comments. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications.